Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful seminar on the future of the corporation. It's a great privilege to be able to share with you some reflections on this very important topic. I'm also very honored to be in this panel with my good and admired friend, Professor Colin Mayer. It's also a privilege to be with Chairman Endo and with all your colleagues from RIETI and also from Waseda University. So thank you very much for allowing me to be with you today. We see in different parts of the world, not only in North America, but also in Europe and in some Asian countries as well, that companies still have a very important reputational problem. As Professor Colin Mayer just highlighted, there are a number of challenges in today's society that are emerging from actions directly promoted by companies. It's not only the responsibility of companies to solve those problems, but it is also very clear that companies are drivers of some of those problems. We may think about climate change. We may think about inequality in some countries, in some regions around the world. We may think about, for instance, the use of data by some companies that actually get that data from their customers and then eventually sell that data for other purposes. So we see a number of big challenges that are created in today's society through the direct action of companies. It's also true that some of our colleagues, when they are presented with these basic data, they say, look, we need governments to step in, and we need governments to have a much more stronger regulation to force companies to behave in a proper way. And as Professor Mayer has also highlighted, regulation is not always very accurate. It's not always very effective in tackling some problems. It tends to arrive a bit late. And as it happens in many countries, perhaps the US is the paradigm of this behavior. Regulation comes in forms that actually are the outcome of horse trading among the different parties, not the best solution for society. So the question for companies is not just a question for board directors, for management teams. I think it's a question that actually has an impact on the whole society, because societies need dynamic companies, effective companies, but also companies that promote long-term sustainable growth and innovation. So the challenge for all of us is how we actually help companies and help companies' governance to take into account all those direct and indirect impacts of their actions that are not truly somehow accounted and taken into account in disclosing the company's performance. In this respect, the notion of purpose that Professor Colin Mayer has been proposing for the past few years, perhaps in the tradition of management studies throughout the 20th century, a similar notion, it's not exactly the same, but a similar notion of a mission was very much present in many companies. I have to say, in a special way, in Japanese companies. I think that Japanese companies that have been around for more than 100 years, as Chairman Endo highlighted before, many of them have this notion of mission that explains why a company is trying to do what it tries to do. So we need to make sure that purpose, as we are using this concept today, as Professor Mayer has been extensively explaining what it means and how we should make it more explicit and articulated around companies' activities, how we actually use purpose in a much more effective way to tackle some of the challenges that companies are creating to society. I would like to focus this presentation very much on a specific dimension of purpose, which is how companies can adopt purpose, and more specifically, how boards of directors the central piece in corporate governance in any company, how boards of directors can actually work with purpose. Let me just, first of all, share with you a bit of a summary of some of the ideas that you have been discussing over the past few parts in this series. Some ideas that Professor Colin Mayer has been highlighting one way or another in the past and in today's presentation. I think that for boards of directors and senior management teams, when we think about corporate purpose, we need to at least think about 6 basic dimensions. First dimension is that purpose should actually try to identify a challenge, a problem, a need that the company wants to solve, wants to offer a solution. This challenge has to be focused on customers. A company, as Peter Drucker suggested, a company exists to serve a customer. And if there is no customer, there is no company. If there is not a customer need, there is no way to organize, to set up a company. So how boards of directors and senior management teams actually keep customers and their needs very much as the driving force of the initiative is very important. Purpose should also foster employees, people's engagement. A major problem in today's society is that many employees in many companies around the world do not feel particularly engaged, committed to the company they work in. One of the paradoxes that we're seeing today, and one of the effects of the global pandemic, we went back home to work from home, and now what happens that many people do not want to go back to work. They prefer working from home. So you see large international companies, somehow one way or another forcing employees to go back to work, to go back to their offices. So the challenge here is, are those people truly engaged? And does the board of directors truly make an effort to engage its employees? So this is, I think, a very, very important dimension. Fourth dimension is that corporate purpose should be integrated deeply and coherently with the firm's strategy and the business model. The business model, as you know very well, is the specific way through which a strategy is being deployed, implemented, and in the combination of activities, investments, and operations that the company deploys to execute its strategy. Purpose should be there. Without purpose in the business model, it's very difficult that purpose actually becomes relevant for companies. Purpose should also take into account, one way or another, the relevant ESG dimensions that a company should take into account. It's very clear that companies have an environmental impact, that companies have a social impact, and the effects and the costs of that impact should be taken into account, not just trying to measure the true profit of the company, but in a very important way, how the solutions, how the proposals that the company makes to solve some specific problems actually take into account those dimensions. So today we see a flood of ESG policies and recommendations that companies should follow. We have those international accounting standards trying to define specific measures of those ESG factors. And those efforts are very relevant, very important. But the true relevant factor here for companies and boards of directors is how those material factors, those material dimensions that actually the company creates and that have an impact on the company's performance are taken into account. And finally, and this is something that Professor Colin Mayer has been working on for the past few years, how to take into account the impact of purpose. And the impact of purpose, not only in terms of profits, profit is an indicator of corporate performance, but it's not the only one. And there is also a great tradition in management literature to understand in a more holistic, systemic way how companies actually create value, not just economic value, how they create social value, how they create also the potential to innovate, to solve future problems. And this is the type of overall impact that a board of directors should actually take into account. This is more or less simple to define, but it's difficult to implement. Let me share with you some experiences of some European companies I have been working with over the past few years that have been trying to adopt one notion, more or less, one notion of purpose in their governance model, and the effort that they have to make to translate that purpose into an operational solution. Let me share with you the case of Danone. Danone is this very large, very successful in many ways, French, fast-moving consumer goods company, especially in the food industry, the largest producer in the world of yogurts, and a company that has been integrating a number of environmental and social dimensions into its strategy for many years, not just in recent years, but for many years. Back in 2014, the then chairman of the board, Frank Riboud, decided to step down as, first of all, chief executive and later on a chairman of the board. And a person who had been a veteran of Danone, who had been with the company for 30 years, Emmanuel Faber, was chosen as first CEO of the company and then a chairman and CEO of the company. He has been doing a very good job in many dimensions, and a very specific dimension has been somehow highlighting even deeper and better the notion of purpose. But let me perhaps use this I would say very good intention of Danone with the problems that companies also have in this changing business world. The world of fast-moving consumer goods has been changing very quickly over the past few years with a fragmentation of consumer preferences. The importance of local brands and local markets has become even more important. So it's no longer valid to have a global brand name to sell food, to sell beverages. You need to be local. You need to be more adapted to the local context. The explosion of internet and e-commerce, not just for books, for music, but also for food products, for beverages, means that the distribution of food and beverages today is more digital than ever. So it's e-commerce is playing here a very important role. So all those transformations of the past very short period of time have been hitting Danone and other companies in a very special way. So even if the company and the board of directors actually had a very clear definition that Danone had to have not just a commercial orientation, but also an orientation to take into account its environmental impact, its social impact. For one reason or another, the company was a bit slow in actually adjusting to those changing market conditions and changing consumers' conditions. So one of the dimensions of purpose, which is very important, to integrate purpose into strategy, business model, and more important, to take into account consumers' needs, somehow was missing here. So let me share with you that part of the problem that Danone has had over the past few months that actually led to the firing of Emmanuel Faber, CEO of the company, doesn't have much to do with whether the company is adopting strongly a notion of purpose. Doesn't have to do with it. It's about the implementation of purpose. And I would like to focus the rest of my presentation on what boards of directors can actually do in terms of adopting purpose in a very coherent way, in a very sustainable way. I would like to make a reference to another company that I have been working with over the past few years, understanding it a bit better, which is Unilever. Unilever actually adopted a more formal notion of purpose back in 2010, when Paul Polman, its chief executive at that time, worked on the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which actually became a very holistic model, starting with purpose, values, vision, strategy, business model, down to all corporate policies, and also a very comprehensive way of understanding how to measure the impact of the company. And it's not an easy exercise. It was not easy, so much so that back in 2017, Unilever was the target of a hostile takeover. It got a bid from Kraft, Heinz, the US food and beverages companies. But because the model of purpose that Unilever actually had adopted, and it's very consistent integration with a vision, with corporate values, strategy, business model, and other corporate policies, Paul Polman and his team and the board of directors of Unilever were able to explain to key shareholders right away why their model was superior in terms of creating a long-term economic value for shareholders, but also a positive value for society, for consumers, for planet. So it's a very important dimension that we need to take into account, how boards of directors actually adopt this more holistic vision of purpose. Let me share with you a few questions that in my work with some of those companies actually have emerged. And it's a debate that in some ways Dr. Endo and his experience at ENC has actually highlighted in his presentation. But I would like to share some of those questions with you. First question is whether the board of directors truly understand the firm's purpose, not just the notion of purpose, but how purpose actually gets integrated, gets developed in a very consistent way with the whole business model. Whether the board of directors truly understand the specific customers' needs that the company is trying to serve. And this is also a very interesting reflection in working with boards of directors. One of the things that one can observe from time to time is that boards of directors are very busy dealing with compliance, dealing with very important strategic issues, dealing with M&A, dealing with finance, dealing with activist investors. All those things are very important. But a key indicator of the work of the board of directors in corporate purpose is whether they pay attention to customers. How much time do boards of directors spend trying to understand, customers' needs, customers' solutions, customers' satisfaction with what the company is trying to do? In parallel with customers, the second implication of a good corporate purpose for a company is how it actually motivates, engages, and gets the commitment of its employees. And more important, why talented people would like to work with a specific company. We see how younger generations today have a problem of being somehow identified with companies and being committed to companies. And a very important implication of purpose is how much and how deep a corporate purpose actually helps integrate young people into the company. Again, this is a very clear question and focus for the board of directors. Question number 4 is how corporate strategy is connected with purpose. This is something that Professor Mayer has actually made a reference to before, and I want just to mention it here. I would like to add a few additional questions. If a company has a purpose that is truly, thoroughly, holistically integrated with strategy, with business model, boards of directors will be able to answer a very specific question. Why do investors want to actually invest in this firm? And which type of time horizon do those investors actually have? And whether investors have actually a time horizon which matches reasonably well with the time horizons of the company. Very important issue. Sometimes boards of directors think about investors in terms of returns, total returns for shareholders, or delivery of the performance that they committed to in strategic plans, but very little thought and very little reflection upon which type of investors does this company have to promote sustainable growth, sustainable value creation for the long term. A 6th question is which impact purpose actually has on hiring, developing, obviously CEOs, but not just CEOs, senior management teams. Is purpose something that truly influences leadership development? And more important, how purpose integrates with corporate values and corporate culture to develop a type of corporate leadership that actually makes purpose sustainable and makes the actions of boards of directors and senior managers truly consistent with purpose. Seventh question is, what's the impact of purpose on other stakeholders? In other words, is the notion of purpose truly holistic? Is the notion of purpose truly takes into account the interactions that a company has with other stakeholders, let's say with suppliers? How deep and how holistically a company takes into account the integrated value chain from the original, let's say, sourcing of raw materials down to the impact that its products and services may have on planet, for instance. And finally, is how we actually assess, how we measure the overall impact of purpose. And obviously the overall impact of purpose has to be reflected in some financial indicators, but it's also, I think, a question of trying to understand how good is the potential of this company, because it serves real customers' needs, because it integrates people, it develops a good leadership model and a good governance model. It takes into account all stakeholders, that the company has a potential to grow in the future. I think that the issue of corporate performance and the maximization of profits is something that has to do with essentially with short-term horizons. And we need in society to think about the long term. And boards of directors need to think about companies in the long term and how sustainable they are in generating true value for the long term. So I would like to stop here, just leaving those questions that I think are truly relevant in helping companies, helping boards of directors adopt a good, a solid, a well-developed notion of purpose, understanding that if boards of directors actually work on this notion of purpose and try to implementing this notion in a very holistic, very consistent way, they may create companies, they may help develop companies that are not only more sustainable from a financial viewpoint, a human viewpoint, an innovation viewpoint, but also companies that provide society with this dynamism, with this value creation process that actually society is required. And they will help turn their companies into more respected institutions in society. I stop here. Thank you very much for your kind attention.